Yeah. What number is it? Yeah, I got 918 on. Good morning. At this time, I'm going to ask Mr. Weldon if he'll open us in prayer.
Dear Lord, thank you for the day. Thank you for the obligations you've placed on each one of us here. Thank you, Lord, for the work that you've allowed us to do. Thank you for the opportunity to represent the people that you've placed ahead of us and who we serve. Give us strength and endurance. Give us courage. Remove our fear. Allow us to use the sound mind you give us. Have you will in all of our lives.
Thank you. Okay. Chairman, get to the front. Brevity, please. Oh. Ladies and gentlemen, in the rear of your building, campaigning, shaking hands and other things. If there's babies to kiss, this guy will do that. Y'all see what I have to deal with over on the roof, so. Well, your door's open, but what about, are you passing any of our bills? You were correct on that issues. We've got a lot of issues. I appreciate you coming to the rules of the house, and I will come see you. Thank you, Jeff. Okay, Wall, here it is. Your number, where it is on the page, and brevity. Mr. Towson.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and other members of the committee. I started saying still this is a good bill. This piece of legislation 180 changes the allocation of special license plates fees by revising the fee portion that are deposited into the state of Georgia General Fund and the fees portion that is transferred to the funds of the individual specialist license plate sponsoring organization. Oh, I'm sorry. The bill number, I thought I said it was 180 LC 39065-4S.
Any questions, Mr. Towson? Mr. Roberts. Try it again. Try it again. There you go.
Yes, sir.
Just one quick question. What is going to be the hit on the budget if we change and allocate the way these things are allocated right now?
What kind of
Is there a financial hit to the budget?
Yes, sir. I have a physical note on it.
Could you tell me?
This will be approximately $2 million the first.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Ramsey, or who's two? Mr. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In response to Chairman Roberts' question, the budget change is less than $100,000 a year until 2020, and then the tag split actually kicks in, and then it's about I think, if I remember correctly, about a $2 million reduction, but the money is actually going, most of it, to DNR on the specialized non-game funds.
Thank you, Mr. Talbot.
Thank you.
Mr. Dollar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, today I bring HB 854, which is about midway on the first page. This bill is dealing with condo associations. It's changing the special assessment fee from $200 to 1/6 of the annual dues. That $200 was set back in 1990, and Georgia is currently the only state that has such a cap.
Questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Y'all, if you're wondering, I can't see a thing. Mr. Battles.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 2, about 6 down, House Bill 295. This has to do with the amending of Title 48 of the OCGA as a revision of the provisions that's regarding ad valorem tax. I believe that there is also an amendment that Chairman Hamilton has to add to this.
Any questions of Mr. Battles? Mr. Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Have an amendment, AM 340632ER. Several years ago, we moved the Board of Equalization responsibility over to the Clerk of Courts, and this is a compensation measure that was never added, and we're late in the session, and this simply adds that to that measure, and I've talked to the author and other people, and is being supported by the Clerk of the Courts. And I'd ask for your favorable consideration of this amendment.
Questions? Do I hear a move, Mr. Hamilton? Yes. Move and second. All right, this is an amendment for a floor vote. This is a rules amendment for a floor vote. All those in favor of adding this amendment signify by aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, the motion is on. Mr.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have House Bill 1051. It's on page 3, about 6 up from the bottom. This is substitute LC number 362522S. Currently, when you apply for a professional license, you have to supply all of the information to prove citizenship and residency. What this will do is will allow, if you already have a secure driver's license, the Secretary of State's office can communicate with driver services and get that verification, and you don't have to continue to present the same materials over that you just did to get your driver's license. So should speed up the process for the Secretary of State's office.
Mr. Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm in complete support of this. So we were working on a bill in our committee yesterday that'll be in rules today that deals with the same measure for another department. So the language has been perfected at this time to allow this to happen. I was told yesterday that there were still some questions on the language.
Legislative Council has worked with both Secretary of State's office and Driver Services, and they have signed off on it, is our understanding.
Okay. Just one follow-up question. At the appropriate time through the committee process or the legislative process, would you be open to adding other departments that could benefit from, by adding other departments or other agencies that could also benefit by this streamlined process?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Just a word to both of you. What day is today? This is 28, and that would have to be a rules. It's modified structure, so it would have to be a rules amendment, and so you've got a little time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Maxwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm back on House Bill 601. It's on the front page. And the several times I've been here, I failed to mention that this is a substitute. It's not the original bill that dealt with the fees and what the probate judges paid. This is a substitute piece of legislation that merely changes the COLAs that are granted to the probate court's retirement fund. All the other language was taken out in the substitute. Then I got House Bill 974, about 8 bills from the bottom, and this is Peace Officers Annuity Benefit Fund, and that's changing their buy-in procedures, paying full actuarial costs.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Burns.
Page 1, HB 549. Good morning. This bill, I've worked on it for a couple of years, is an emergency response bill for environmental issues. It just seeks to implement some common sense. EPD has already started this process, and they've implemented some of these issues, but we need to make sure that we include local responders and other state agencies when there is an environmental issue, that we respond to that issue quickly and appropriately. And we've worked with the conservation folks and with industry, and we have an agreement on the language on this bill, but believe it will help mitigate the damage that could occur when we do have an environmental spill.
Any questions, Mr. Burns? Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, I bring to you the substitute to House Bill 690. It's on the first page, fifth bill down. Deals with annexation by cities, which I call forced annexation. The bill, there is a substitute, and the language is changing it to mediation rather than binding arbitration. Bill passed out of Governmental Affairs unanimously yesterday morning. So,
any questions?
Thank you.
Mr. Jacobs.
Morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the Rules Committee. I'm here again this morning on House Bill 977. On the first page, modified open. This is the bill that simply removes personal confidential information such as Social Security numbers and bank account numbers from civil court filings.
Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Caldwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I do want to note what a seamless transition it was between me and the chairman, so as you think of future chairman. I'm here to bring forward House Bill 886, which is halfway down on the first page. This is the piece of legislation that would require public hearings and financial transparency of school districts and charter schools in the state. They are the only form of local government or political subdivision we don't already require public hearings on prior to passage of a budget. This passed unanimously out of both the Education Subcommittee and the Education Full Committee. There is no opposition to the bill. We worked with the Georgia School Board Association, the Charter School Association, and about 15 other groups to make this bill happen. Pretty excited about it, and I'm excited to go steal that freshman bass. So I'd ask for your favorable consideration and help in that endeavor.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Fleming.
Members of the committee, Mr. Chairman, on page 3, under modified open, page 3, House Bill 1000, almost halfway down the page, House Bill 1000. Mr. Chairman, this deals with the collection of court-imposed fines. We already allow in Georgia, if you're a deadbeat parent, for example, and not paying your child support, if you ask the state of Georgia for an income tax refund, they'll make sure your child support comes out first. This would change the law to allow for court-imposed fines for the same thing to happen.
Questions?
What other? If no other questions, Chairman, I have that. My other one is on the same page, a little closer to the top, HB 891. HB 891. This allows city elections only to have early voting go to 1 week.
The minority leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do not see it on the desk, but I provided last week an amendment to this bill. I'm not sure if now is the appropriate time to consider that amendment, or if we can request copies to be handed out to the body.
Mr. Fleming, stick around.
Yes, sir, I will.
Ms. Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I asked for two bills today. On page 2, under modified structure, the bottom of the page, House Bill 788. Thank you for your favorable consideration of the amendment to this bill yesterday. This bill seeks to preserve a tax exemption for property for the University System of Georgia.
Any questions? Thank you.
Also on page 3, under modified structured, House Bill 908 to extend the sunset date for the collection of fees on the tires for the Solid Waste Trust Fund.
That's mine and Jay Powell's favorite bill. Isn't it, Jay? I didn't know. I signed that thing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members. Bring to you today, asking again on page 3, modified structured, about a third of the way down, HB 957. Modifies the existing Georgia Brownfields Act to allow that existing legislation to continue to allow toxic sites to be cleaned up and redeveloped. I ask for your favorable consideration.
Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Dudgeon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, I bring you again towards the top of page 3, modified structured House Bill 897. This is a consolidated education bill, a lot of things in Title 20, well vetted through many meetings and many amendments for different folks to make people happy. And y'all were kind enough to approve an amendment last meeting.
Any questions? Thank you. Mr. Epps.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 3 on the modified structured, 4 down from the top, HB 881, legislation. This legislation would introduce a new specialty license plate benefiting Grady Health Foundation to support and improve the quality of health care services.
Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Kirby.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 3, under modified structured, 15 bills down, I bring to you HB 985. This bill would make it a felony to knowingly file false documents such as a claim deed when people have broken in and illegally occupied a home. It passed out of committee unanimously and have not had any opposition other than from the criminals.
No questions. Thank you. Mr. Pack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. On page 4, under structural rule, the second bill, House Bill 658. This bill would repeal off the books Georgia's estate tax.
Mr. Powell.
What's the fiscal impact?
There is zero fiscal impact. Matter of fact, there's a nominal savings from not having to administer the Georgia portion of the estate tax.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Tanner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page number 3, third up from the bottom, House Resolution 1183, this would add a couple of words into a constitutional amendment that passed in 1998 that assists the Brain and Spinal Injury Trust Commission to include the words "or reckless driving," and that those funds would go to the Brain Injury Spinal Trust Commission. Again, this would be calling for a constitutional amendment to make that one change.
Questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Carson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, fourth page, the top of the page, under structured rule, House Bill 153. This would allow counties, at their option, it's completely optional, to put up for referendum a SPLOST rate at less than 1%. This also includes a stipulation that if a county is going to propose a rate of less than 1%, they must sign an IGA with all of the cities in the county.
Questions? No questions. Thank you. Mr. Hitchens.
On page number 2, about halfway down under modified structure rule, House Bill 459. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, this bill became known in the media last year as the Slowpoke bill. Simply stated, what it does is it puts a duty upon the driver in the left-hand lane of a multi-lane highway with vehicles traveling in the same direction to move to the right as soon as reasonably practicable, irrespective of their speed.
There should be no questions.
What do you say?
If you're a good shot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Mabry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I have two bills. First bill, HB 828 on the first page, modified open rule. Seventh bill, HB 828 stops ambulance chasing, stops attorneys, runners, doctors from contacting car wreck victims to get them to come in their office for legal representation and for medical treatment, gives mandatory jail time, and also a fine for doing this illegal activity. That's the first bill. Second bill, top of the third page, House Bill 827. This is a great bill right here for student athletes. Great bill right here for student athletes. Allows them to leave the house an hour early so they can get to school, work out, get showered up, and get to homeroom before the bell rings. Right now, teenage drivers can't drive between 12 and 6. It moves it an hour back to 12 to 5. They can't drive, but they can leave the house at 5 o'clock, get to the school, and work out and have a good time.
You do have two good bills.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Another miracle.
Thank you.
Ms. Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I present for your consideration HB 833, top of the first page, open rule. This is a simple bill that would change throughout the Georgia Code the use of the word slum for the more preferred term of art, blight, so that municipalities can get federal tax dollars.
Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Glanton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I bring to you again House Bill 1009, which is fourth from the bottom on page 1 under modified open. And simply, Mr. Chairman, this bill just extends the amount of time that the residents of Clayton County has to decide whether or not they want to participate in MARTA and expand MARTA into Clayton County. And I would ask for your favor consideration of this bill.
No questions. Thank you. Mr. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First page, bring to you House Bill 750, which will alleviate the mortgage licensing origination requirements for certain nonprofits as administered with the oversight of the Banking and Finance Commission.
Any questions? Mr. Fry, you've been here more than anybody. You don't have to come back anymore.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Strickland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, I bring to you House Bill 1027. It's on page 3, about 3/4 of the way down. This Department of Labor, Federal Compliance, and Cleanup Bill concerning unemployment benefits.
Any questions, Mr. Strickland? Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I bring to you today House Bill 405, which would require the boards of charter schools to participate in governance training. I'm sorry, it's on the first page under modified open rule, first one on the list.
No questions. Thank you. Ms. Chandler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Page 2, the last item is HB 810, and this is a simple little bill that lowers the percentile from the 85th to the 80th for students graduating from an ineligible school to be able to receive the HOPE. Still much above the students graduating from an eligible school. Students from an eligible school have to have a B average, no SAT, no ACT.
Any questions? Ms. Evans?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Wait.
Hello. It's not working.
You're on. Try it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Just
No,
speak
I
up a
can't
little
hear.
bit.
I'll just yell. Representative Taylor, do you know how many students will be brought into eligibility under the change provision?
I do not know. It was very hard to find that figure. I know that about 5% of the numbers of students who take the SAT and ACT fall into that ineligible school grouping. I understand there is no physical note to this of significance.
Ms. Jones.
I did just want to mention, I was given some information from the governor's office, and well, it wasn't the governor's office, I guess it was DOE, and they projected it would be a few hundred, because it also includes schools, you know, not just homeschool students, but also unaccredited schools.
That's right.
But it was very few. And that's why there was no fiscal note.
No more questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Waits.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, members of the committee. I bring before you House Bill 700. On page 1, under Modified Open Rule, HB 700. This legislation brings us into full compliance with the American Disabilities Act and provides increased accessibility for persons with disabilities at the state capitol, Coverdale Legislative Office buildings by requiring braille and tactile signage to be placed throughout both buildings. I ask for your favorable consideration. Thank you.
Any questions? Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. I missed one. Ms. Jones.
So I just wanted to make, so it has to do with the signage.
Correct.
So that it could be, say, as those who are blind or sight impaired could get around easier. Is that?
Yes, ma'am. Specifically your elevators as well as your restrooms.
All right, thank you.
Any questions? Thank you. The big bopper, Mr. Hatchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Where's my ice cream?
I'll be sure to bring you some.
Chocolate.
Page 3, HB 998 under modified structured. This bill will give the Georgia Board of Physician Workforce more flexibility in determining an area medically underserved and rural as far as loan forgiveness through service, as far as recruiting physicians. 998, page 3, modified structure.
Any questions, Mr. Hatchett? Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Pruitt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee, on the bottom of page 1 in the modified open rule, 1030, 1031, and then the first one on the second page at the top, HB 1032. They're all the same with different offices, but it's changing these 3 offices: magistrate, court, chief magistrate, the office of the coroner, and the probate court to non-party.
Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Coomer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know you're a man of faith, and you appreciate the words of Jesus, "The last shall be first, and the first shall be last." So, but I'm definitely last today, in the line anyway. House Bill 923 is on page 3 under modified structure. That's the Journey and Coward Act that has to deal with the child fatality review panels. Ask that you bring that out today. House Bill 923, Child Fatality Review Panel.
Any questions? No question. Next.
Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, let's go back. We're going to go back to Mr. Fleming. All right. This is HB 891. Mr. Pruitt, if you'll move. Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've spoken with the author of the legislation about this amendment, and although I appreciate and support his underlying premise, we disagree about the amendment. This amendment would simply allow cities to opt out of a one-week provision. Under the terms of HB 891, every municipality would be compelled to only have 1 week of early voting. However, large cities like Atlanta and Savannah would be captured by this legislation. However, consolidated cities like Columbus, Athens, and Macon would not be. The mayors of Atlanta and Savannah have both expressed a strong interest in being allowed to opt out and to return to the 3-week early voting period. I would ask this committee's favorable consideration of this bill. It does not mandate anything. It simply allows by local act those cities that are non-conformants, or those cities who would seek to be a 3-week city, to be so. The other piece I would point out is there was some concern about uniformity. I would point out that there are often municipal laws that differ from city to city, and this would simply allow those larger cities to undertake the education to allow their citizens to know that they can early vote for up to 3 weeks. Thank you, sir.
Do you put that in the form of a motion?
Sir, I move due pass of AM 281300.
Do I have a second? All right, this will be an amendment that will go on the floor for a vote. All those in favor signify by aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Mr. Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I bring before the committee House Bill 960. 960 just deals with the Beltline in Atlanta. It deals with the city of Atlanta only. It does not affect anything outside the Beltline.
Any questions of Mr. Roberts? Mr. Benton. If you have a question of the author, just raise your hand because all my lights are lit up. Okay. Mr. Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 2, House Bill 702, the Religious Freedom Monument. I'd very much like to see that placed on the calendar. 702. You want me to explain it? Or?
No.
Okay, you're looking at it. Yes,
Mr. Peake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Present HB 918, the very last page. It's the annual IRC update and match up state tax code with Internal Revenue Code. Also provides, the department has asked third-party payroll providers submit state tax withholding registration applications electronically to aid in processing those withholding tax returns.
Any questions? Okay. Mr. Weldon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the page 2, under modified structure, House Bill 460, which is the Georgia Firefighters Pension Fund bill, this just says that any person that's incarcerated is not eligible to become a member of the fund. And it also says that if they are a member, but they are incarcerated, they don't get credible time as acting as a firefighter while they're incarcerated. And then House Bill 580, which is right below the next bill down. This is Superior Court Clerk's Retirement Fund. It allows them to elect spousal benefits upon retirement as opposed to upon hiring. And that's something that the clerks have asked for and asked to be favorably considered. And also on the yellow pages, page 3, 1/3 from the top, House Bill 965. This is the Georgia 911 Medical Amnesty Law Act.
I don't have, we'll do it tomorrow. I don't have a yellow sheet. Mr. Setzler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the top of page 4, I would like to put my name next to and urge strongest consideration of HB 153.
Which one is it, Ed?
Top of page 153. That's the fractional penny local option sales tax. Would like to urge the committee's consideration of bringing that to the floor.
Ms. Cooper. Wait, you got anything else?
I just very.
Ms. Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask for House Bill 899 is the one to better protect our most vulnerable seniors that live in little tiny personal care homes, and they're usually our poorest seniors. And it's on the 3rd page, I'm sorry. And also on that page is House Bill 966. It's a companion bill that goes with the 911 bill that's on today. There is a drug called Norcam, which acts almost like an EpiPen when people have respiratory failure and overdose.
We're having real trouble here. Yeah. Try the last one. I got 899.
House Bill 966 is like a companion bill that goes along with the 911 bill that we will be on for today. There is a new drug called Narcan is the name. It acts to reverse drug overdose and respiratory failure. It's almost like Nebucan that can be administered, and this would allow first responders and also family members that have a problem with this to have the drug.
Any questions? Thank you. Mr. Powell. Any questions? Wait a second. Oh, okay. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Any questions? Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would ask for favorable consideration for HB 833, HB 750 from two of our...
Wait.
HB 833, which is at the top of the page, Ms. Jones, who has been here quite frequently.
Okay.
HB 750, Mr. Fry.
Got it.
HB 828, Mr. Mayo, who seeks to make being a lawyer an honorable profession again. HB 1009, Mr. Glanton's bill, which would simply extend the time to join MARTA for Clayton County. And I'd like to put my name beside HB 788, Representative Riley's bill, which would assist most of our colleges and universities with providing housing.
Ms. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am asking you to support House Bill 549, Representative Burns' bill, Water Emergency Response, House Bill 957, Williams' bill, the Brownfield legislation, and House Bill 908, Representative Riley's bill that extends the sunset for the Solid Waste Trust Fund. Thank you.
Ms. Hughley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to bring to your attention for your consideration House Bill 827. I'm sure we all want to help our student athletes. That's Mr. Maber's bill. House Bill 405 having to do with charter schools, and House Bill 700 Braille for our visitors to the Capitol.
Thank you. Mr. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to put my name beside Representative Talton's bill that changes the tag splits in 2020.
What number is that?
I'm sorry, 180.
Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Pruitt's nonpartisan bills 1030, 1031, 1032, and House Bill 887 by Chairperson Penny Houston, removing the bonding requirements. She could not be here today.
Ms. Sims.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to place my name by House Bill 833. That's Ms. Jones's bill that creates a blight instead of a slum in our cities. Also, House Bill 788. That's Representative Riley's bill for the University of Georgia and our regents, and Representative Hatchett's bill. Thank you so much. 998, pardon me.
Mr. Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Because I'm so overwhelmed with glee by Representative Mr. Rural Roberts' newfound global outreach and lawmaking, putting Atlanta on equal footing finally with Ocilla, Georgia, I'd like to put my name by House Bill 960. But I also would like to caution him on time of passage because in his usual over-detailed manner, he has used the dreaded word slum on line 16 as opposed to blight, which I would have hoped he would have been more sagacious in his draftsmanship than that, but it's a lot to expect when you're on a global outreach, as he must be.
Mr. Smyrie.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to put my name by House Bill 788 and 827.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to put my name by 828 and 1009.
You know, Mr. Williams, I've been down here 10 years listening to you, and I've never not heard you until today.
Warming words.
I'm pretty moved by it too.
Can I try again, Mr. Chairman?
I just didn't get the second number.
All right, sir. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to put my name by 828 and 1009, sir.
Would you mind taking Earl down to the doctor? You've just busted his eardrum. Anyone else? All right. Y'all remember what day this is. In my mind, I can visualize seeing you again this afternoon. Okay? So if your bill don't make it, you know it's wandering around there for another day or two, and maybe another day or two of meetings of this committee. So you just bear with me. All right. Modified open. HB 405. Any opposition? It's on. Modified open. HB 549. Any opposition? It's on. Modified open. HB 609. I want that to be a 9. 601. Thank you. Any opposition? It's on. HB 854 under modified open. I beg your pardon? That means 854's yes. So it's 854 will be for Monday. HB 886. Any opposition? HB 887. Any opposition? It's HB 88. Modified structure. Any opposition? Modified structure. HB 459. Any opposition? Modified structure HB 777. Any opposition? Modified structure HB 788. It's on. Sir? Yes, there will be an amendment on that on the. And we did that amendment yesterday. Modified structure HB 810. Any opposition? Modified structure HB 878. 878. Any opposition? Modified structure HB 881. Any opposition? Modified structure 891. It has the amendment from the minority leader that'll be on the floor. HB 897. Any opposition? And that one, that also was amended yesterday, or the amendment was introduced and it'll be on the floor. HB under modified structure HB 899. Have a motion and motion, and we have objection. All those in favor of the motion signify by aye. Those opposed? All those in favor? Let's wait, whoa. Mr. Golick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously there's an objection. If maybe we could have the nature of the objection, so we're clear on the division. Thank you.
Mr. Earhart.
My objection is on line 16, page 1 of House Bill 899. It takes the offense of operating a personal care home in violation of the original subsection B of this from a misdemeanor to a felony conviction. And I haven't been satisfied that the differential between what is operating a personal care home in violation of. If you are a caregiver, a parent, or a child who's operating, are you going to defend yourself against a felony conviction? If somebody in that industry doesn't like you taking care of your mom and your aunt, a felony, that's a significant change in our statutory provisions from a misdemeanor to a felony in such a case. I just don't agree.
Ms. Cooper, use you try your mic.
Okay. Personal care homes are defined in our law, and this is the first I've heard of an objection, and our DA, our chief of police from Marietta, came down and testified that the need for this, because there are so many of these that have 6 or 7 people in them and they're taking their checks, and this is not meant for anybody that is taking care of their mother in their homes. And the other law didn't apply to, the other iteration didn't apply to them either. And I think you've seen them in the news. There was 2 terrible ones in Cobb and Gwinnett, the people that are operating these and starving and not giving medicines to our most vulnerable citizens, often the poor. This is the first objection I've heard.
Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The author had mentioned a couple of days ago or last week that she would get with me, and I'd never gotten an opportunity to speak with you. But the big thing is, and I don't see where it's defined, and clearly defined, and there's already a felony for elder abuse. If you're abusing folk, there's a place in the law for that. I think it's got to be very clear as to what defines and what number are we considered a personal care home. And felony is a pretty stiff fine or sentence.
Mr. Golett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Personal care home, this just to make sure I'm clear and we're all clear, personal care home is defined in the code as opposed to a more personal casual setup of a personal care for family or close relatives or family and so forth. So a personal care home is defined in the code. There are otherwise important and strict licensing procedures. Is that a correct statement?
Anybody? Mr. Sessions. I tell you what, let's do. Everybody that's in here is going to stay in here. Don't open that door again. I can't hear anything. Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I was just asking about, there seems to be question on in division of this issue. I'd certainly like to find out more information on it, Mr. Chairman. And I'll go to the author in due time. So.
Ms. Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just, through the wonder of technology, just was able to pull up the code so I could read the definition of personal care home, which supports Chairman Cooper that this is not, we're not talking about people who are taking care of their aunts. Personal care home means any dwelling, whether operated for profit or not, which undertakes through its ownership or management to provide or arrange for the provision of housing, food service, and one or more personal services for 2 or more adults who are not related to the owner or administrator by blood or marriage.
So there's no nursing services that go with it.
Thank you for that. So, all right. What the motion was is to put it on on the floor for tomorrow. We have objection. It sounds close, so all those in favor signify by raising your hand. All those opposed, like sign. It's on the floor. Yes, ma'am.
Talk to anybody about it or find out any more information that anybody wants as soon as we finish, and I can get it today.
Okay. Modified structure, HB 908. Any opposition? Modified structure, HB 923. Any objection? It's on. Modified structure, HB 957. Any objection? Modified structure, HB 998. Any objection? It's on. Under structured, HB 918. Any objection? So, under structured, HB 153.
Move.
Any objection? Modified open. HB 828.
Move.
Any opposition? That's what we'll start with.